Muchísimas gracias, la Cilia y todo el equipo, muchísimas gracias y felicidades por el tremendo trabajo de organizar esta semana. His Excellency Guillermo Raimondi, Permanent Representative of Argentina and Chair of the Permanent Council, estimado Luis, querido amigo, Secretario General, distinguished permanent and alternate representatives, representatives of observers and other members of observer states and other members of the diplomatic corps, officials, colleagues of the General Secretariat, ladies and gentlemen, muy buenas tardes a todas y todos. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery are the iconic words immortalized by reggae legend Bob Marley in his Redemption song released in 1980. It is undeniably a powerful phrase, a clarion call for resistance to oppression, which has transcended time and stimulated endless conversations about its global impact. While it was popularized by Bob Marley, it was first articulated by the Jamaican Pan-Africanist and Jamaica's first national hero, Marcus Mosiah Garvey. In his Black Man magazine published in 1938, some 40 years before the release of Marley's Redemption song, Garvey wrote, "We are going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery because whilst others might free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind. Mind is your only ruler, sovereign. The man who is not able to develop and use his mind is bound to be the slave of the other man who uses his mind." A true visionary, Garvey traveled across the Americas in the early 1900s, urging black communities to free themselves from negative thoughts and internalized oppression forced upon them through slavery's atrocities, and instead embrace the vitality of their African heritage and identity. While Garvey's teachings were directed to the black community, we now know that his prescient ideals resonate and are applicable to all of humanity. It is in this context that we celebrate the 7th edition of the Inter-American Week for People of African Descent in the Americas, absorbed under the theme, Global Freedom, Emancipate Yourself from Mental Slavery. This year's theme was meticulously selected to align with the core purpose of the Inter-American Week, which is to, inter alia, promote greater understanding of the significance of slavery and the slave trade and of their consequences for the lives of people of African descent. The previous iterations of this seminal week have addressed a myriad of issues pertaining to justice, to education, the arts, and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on vulnerable populations within the Afro-descendant community. As the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent draws to a close, it was fitting that this year's theme for the Inter-American Week encapsulate the foundational spirit and intent of this significant celebration. The legacy of slavery resides in the minds, the beliefs, and thoughts of all humankind. In this regard, everyone must be emancipated from the legacy of slavery, for that is how we will achieve global freedom. Mental slavery persists and manifests itself in everyday interactions. In the context of the enslavement of Africans and the transatlantic slave trade, emancipate yourself from mental slavery means to undo the psychological damage caused by centuries of physical and mental slavery and colonialism. Slavery and its legacy of colonization, which led to repressive laws and policies, such as laws on segregation, also known as apartheid, in some countries, disproportionate mass incarceration, disenfranchisement, lack of constitutional rights, and countless other forms of institutional racial inequities have caused irreparable harm to people of African descent. In many of our societies, people of African descent face higher rates of unemployment and are overrepresented among the poor and underrepresented in decision-making positions. The legacy that the enslavement of Africans has left behind is one that has scarred the collective minds of nations, distorting perceptions of black people. In many societies, people of African descent are viewed as untrustworthy, criminals, and inferior. This has inevitably created a social hierarchy where people of African descent are socio-economically, politically, and culturally stratified lower than other races or ethnic groups. This abhorrent race caste has permeated every facet of society, insidiously rooted in institutional practices and appallingly justified in constitutional litigation. While this is not the stark reality of all societies, particularly where black people are the majority and or enjoy equal rights and political representation, when persons from these societies venture into other communities where they count among the minority, they too are subjected to the endemic discrimination, microaggression, and biases in those societies. We see it often, negative perceptions of Africa and African culture with respect to names, to music, to language, and beauty standards, just to name a few. Religious traditions and faith practices, which derive from traditional African religions, have been vilified and become a metaphor for evil. While physical slavery has been abolished, ill-perceived ideas on race superiority and inferiority still persist. In many respects, as human beings, we continue to be confined and shackled to these preconceived notions about race, where black people are viewed as inferior and their African traditions as subpar. Against this backdrop, this year's Inter-American Week for People of African Descent in the Americas will be celebrated to raise awareness about the negative perceptions of African, black people, and culture, promote and highlight the intrinsic beauty and value of black people and their culture, as well as their impact on the development of our societies. And it will also challenge biased notions about black culture. The OAS Plan of Action for the Decade for People of African Descent in the Americas speaks directly to the topic of equality and awareness, calling on states to, 1, promote acknowledgement of the history of people of African descent, particularly with respect to the consequences or legacies of the historical injustices of the enslavement of Africans in the Americas. And 2, raise the visibility of the cultural, economic, political, and social contributions of people of African descent to progress in our region. This week's activities will include, on Tuesday, that's tomorrow, a webinar organized by the Secretariat for Access to Rights and Equity will be held on the legacy of African religious practices. On Thursday, a roundtable on strategies for economic empowerment of women of African descent, organized by the Permanent Missions of Brazil and the Permanent Mission of Colombia, will be held. On Friday, there will be a special edition of a chat with the OAS in English and Spanish. This is a virtual live event organized by representatives in OAS national offices, which will feature panelists addressing this year's theme. Additionally, our organization's country offices will hold activities in respective member states, including lecture series featuring prominent individuals. Our online activities also include the profiles of renowned personalities that uplift and promote Black culture, and the Adult, Youth, and Children Reading Corner, an online compilation of book titles that promote the importance of Black culture and Black identity. The commemorations will culminate next Monday, the 25th, a week from today, the International Day of Remembrance for Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, with a special session of the Permanent Council under the week's theme, and it will feature presenters and speakers from each of the sub-regional groups of the member states. I wish to thank all the member states for their constant support in the planning and execution of this important week. As these events are not budgeted for in the regular fund, please allow me to give special recognition to those who have made the implementation of this week's activities possible. Thank you to the permanent missions of the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and the United States. And also to the permanent observer missions of France, Italy, and Spain. Without your contributions, several of the activities of the week would not have been possible. My thanks also to all of the secretariats that comprise the General Secretariat, who have collaborated with my office. We value your steadfast support and your commitment. Lastly, I wish to recognize the staff in my office who work tirelessly to prepare for the week's activities, and to acknowledge our representatives in the national offices for their laudable efforts to organize activities in their respective member states. Ladies and gentlemen, global freedom can only be achieved if we can uproot and indeed eradicate racism, hatred, and bigotry, erase false narratives of race supremacy, and acknowledge the inherent duty and humanity of all peoples. To do so necessitates emancipating ourselves from the legacy of African slavery, educating all about the truth, and giving a legacy to younger generations that is grounded in principles of equality and respect. With that said, it is my great honor to open the 2024 Inter-American Week for People of African Descent in the Americas. It is our hope that you will be enlightened and edified by the week's activities, and that it may challenge you to reflect upon your own biases, encourage you to accept and value African heritage, and embolden you to root out racism and discrimination in your own communities. True emancipation from mental slavery can only be achieved through meaningful education about Black heritage and culture, and knowing your own as well as everybody's worth and value in society. For we are not constrained by our circumstances and conditions, but rather by our own mental validation. We must use injustice as a proverbial platform for action and fulfilling our God-given potential. The narrative on Black culture and African history must be rewritten in the annals of history to accurately reflect its impact on society. In the words of Marcus Garvey, a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. It is time that we all reclaim, rediscover, and relearn the truth about Black history and culture. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.